All right, so first, quick shout out to David over at Arbitrary Ambitions. When you guys get a chance, stop by his Facebook page over at Arbitrary Ambitions. He's a super cool guy, really solid company, and what they're doing, I absolutely find it really motivational and uplifting. David's going to be coming out here in the next coming couple of weeks. He's going to be helping us do some classes. Um, his skill set as it relates to what OCTS does is definitely top notch. I very much so respect his opinion. So if you guys want to stop by, meet him, shake his hand, pick his brain for a little bit, feel free to send me a message and I'll pass it off along to him, or just stop by his Facebook page and just give him a message. So with that being said, let's get into this video. So what definitely gets a lot of people's we'll say it gets their asses chafed is when you start talking about reloads, whether it be speed reloads, emergency reloads, tack reloads, or reloads with retention. Now, I understand the counter argument and the pro argument as to each technique, but let's just take a quick second and define each one. So your speed reload, you have a round in the chamber, perhaps you have rounds in your magazine. You drop your magazine, let it free fall to the ground, and then you're putting a new one in, continuing on what you're doing. Emergency reload, bolt lock back to the rear, slide lock back to the rear. You drop your magazine, let it go, put a new one in, send the bolt home, slide home, continue doing what you're doing. Then you have your tack reload. Tack reloads, round in the chamber, rounds in your magazine, so you think. Then you're taking out a new magazine, manipulating both the magazines with one hand, putting the new one in, and then stowing the old one in regards to keeping with ammunition management. The last one, reload with retention. Round in the chamber, unknown amount of rounds in the magazine, perhaps if any. We're dropping the magazine, catching with our support hand, or what we're calling our support hand, stowing it, then grabbing a new one and coming back up to the gun. Now, in keeping in regards to, say, tack reloads or reloads with retention, I get what people say, because a lot of people say that those actually should not be trained for, because while we're doing that, that's actually not handling a weapon in a manner in keeping with a martial manner. And I understand that. And for a couple of years, I went back and forth. Should I do them or should I not? Should I teach them? Should I not? I did teach them for a long time. Then I stopped. Then I started teaching them again. I've kind of come to the conclusion that is definitely something worth noting and keeping in your kit bag, to the point where it should be done in a subconscious manner. As with all mechanical manipulations with our weapons, should be done in a subconscious manner. Now, the goal, if we're doing tack reload, is to absolutely minimize that dwell time, that we only have one round in the chamber. I came to this realization for the simple fact that the first couple times I deployed with the military, I did not have that skill set when I was in Iraq. Looking back at it now in simple reflection, having had that skill set couldn't have served me well in the certain circumstances that I could think up off the top of my head. And the answer to that question, for my own truth, is yes, it could have. Additionally, if I'm at 300 yards and someone's trying to hurt me and I have a rifle, if I can take a simple step to my left or right and find myself some cover, and or I should have had it to begin with, would I just simply let my magazine free fall, or would I put a new one in? And a counter argument to that a lot of people say is they'll call it lulls, that you will top your gun off if there's a lull in a fight. And the problem with that there being that, and I get it, is that you will not know there was a lull until it actually already has passed, which makes sense. So rather, a lot of people have been using a better definition as if I found an opportunity to top off my gun. So when keeping with whatever definition you choose to use, time is distance, distance is time, which is where the hourglass comes from. Distance and time being two of the biggest factors that go into how we're actually going to perform that task at that given situation. Now, in terms of the emergency reload, when the bolt locks back to the rear, that technique has kind of evolved, and it keeps evolving over the years. And that's what the video is really going to focus on today. What works best for you, what works best for me. What works really good for me might not work good for you, as it might not work good for others. So we're going to look at a couple different techniques for the actual act of doing an emergency reload, because I would absolutely favor that reload over the simple act of topping off my gun in most all given circumstances. The way I was taught to do it when I was first growing up in the military to where we're actually at now, and everything that happened in between, and why we actually came to the conclusion as to why I am going to do this right now in the manner that I do it. Now, the way I first grew up doing emergency reloads is we were always taught, no matter what the circumstances were, that when the gun went to bolt lock, you were to take a knee, point your muzzle down, stare at your magazine well with your head down, reload it, send the bolt home, and then stand back up and fire 2 more rounds. Now, admittedly, if you do that at a certain distance, by taking a knee, will it lower your silhouette? Well, absolutely. If you're taking a knee at, say, 50 or 100 yards, to say that it's going to reduce your silhouette to the extent possible where it's actually worth doing that, well, that's just asinine. Additionally, a lot of people say that you always revert back to your lowest level of training, given the appropriate amount of stress, stress being equal to how we're actually perceiving it and the distance that the threat is from us. So, more appropriately, you actually fall back on your lowest level of mastered training. So if we always take a knee when we reload, you will take a knee given a certain set of circumstances and stress. So the way that looks, how I was brought up to actually reload is like this. Cold, hot. As I was saying before, admittedly, if you take a knee and you're at a far enough distance, that could be beneficial to us, but there's too many cons to that technique than there is pros. If you're obviously behind a wall or something, we'll probably be firing from the kneeling position as it was. So that one has to get ruled out. It's something that is not something I want to perform all the time. Now, the next technique that we're going to get into is the next one that I actually started using for a good number of years, and that's simply because I was told to. All right, the second technique that we started adopting for a while was simply here. If your rifle is up, as soon as it went to bolt lock, we were simply just dropping the magazine without ever having moved the rifle, and while keeping our eyes through either your optic or your apertures, whatever you're using, grabbing a new one, putting it in, sending the bolt home, and firing 2 more. The way that looks is just like this. So with that, does that work? Well, sure. But no matter what technique that we're going to kind of come to rest upon, 1, we can't be absolute to it, and 2, it needs to work day and night, and it also needs to work in a variety of circumstances. So does that work if I'm absolutely standing still and I have no intention of moving? Well, sure. Does it work if I'm actually trying to move? And the timer went off again. Does it actually work if I'm trying to move? No, it will not. If I try and reload that gun while I'm on the move, I'm going to chase my magazine well around with a magazine, and everyone's just simply going to laugh at me, and it's not going to work out well. So I had to rule that one out as something that's pretty ineffective, and I had to drop that one as well. All right, this next one gained a lot of notoriety around the 2007 to 2008 time frame. I might be misspeaking, so don't quote me on that. But what was being taught was that as you were firing, that rather than just dump the magazine, to take that quick glance into your chamber, to actually verify the bolt went to bolt lock. So theory being, you're not putting a good magazine into a bad gun if you had a double feed or something like that. Now, I get that. I used it to the point where I was actually pretty proficient at it, and just being from a bit of a military background, being in the woods at 2 o'clock in the morning, doing Battle Drill 1 for the 1000th time to appease somebody, that particular environment was absolutely no light. As a result of it, I've never seen in my chamber at night. Now, admittedly, with that, a counter argument is that regular people, are you going to be in an absolute zero light conditions? The answer to that is probably not. As we're moving about around in town, I don't know why you have an AR with you while you're in the parking lot of Walmart, unless you're one of those guys who keep it in their trunk, but whatever. Is there ever going to be an environment where there's absolutely zero light around town? Probably not. But for me, in my particular application, it just didn't make sense for me to do that. At that particular moment, that was pretty much just excessive wasted movement. Now, contradiction to that a little bit is that a lot of people, when they come out to the range and they're actually working on this particular technique, what you often see a lot of times is people gaming it. So the dudes will throw like 4 or 5 rounds into their magazine, and they'll know exactly how many rounds in their magazine. So all their reloads essentially are gamed. They know exactly when their bolt is probably going to go in the bolt lock. So although I did abandon this method from time to time, if when my bolt does hit lock, and I'm kind of surprised by it, do I once in a while take a quick glance into my chamber to see if it was empty? The answer to that is yes. So I've kind of dabbled in between using it and not using it, which is sort of a contradiction, but in general terms, I've abandoned it. And the way this looks is just like this. So there's certain elements of it that does make sense. A lot of people have turned it into a bit of a circus trick. Now, one additional problem that it's definitely worth taking note of is actual dirt and grit and grime on your magazine. Out here in the range, I've definitely found that my magazines absolutely do free fall pretty much all the time. However, have I had magazines that have not free falled all the time? Well, hell yeah. Whether if someone calls it over lubrication or whatever the case may be, where dudes throw CLP or whatever they're using in their gun and you see it leaking out between the upper and lower receiver, and then you get a lot of grime and grit on your feed rams, or whatever the case may be, dirt in your magazine well, is this always guaranteed to free fall out every single time? Well, hell no. So what I'd actually rather offer is, if you're hell bent on using this particular one, that after you fire your last round, if you do choose to identify that the bolt went to bolt lock, well, as you're trying to release that magazine, because the magazine coming out, keep in mind, that was a byproduct of the technique. As you try and hit the magazine release and the magazine didn't come out, well, your hand already has to pass over this particular area to get a new magazine. So if it didn't come out, just simply strip on the way out, grab a new one, put it back in, send your bolt home, and going back to what you're doing. So no matter what, always evaluate, reevaluate, and then validate, and then ultimately see if it applies to you. Next technique, similar to the last one, but just minus the chamber check. Pretty self-explanatory. Some pros of it, well, if we're moving and we keep our weapon here, right in our arm that we have right now, with the stock tucked between our bicep and our breastplate right here, right kind of towards our ribs, as our hands are naturally moving and we're running, it actually kind of minimizes the movement of our magazine well. Subsequently, if your muzzle is just slightly elevated, it is way easier to actually get a mag into your magazine well while you're on the move. So the way this technique looks is just like this. Now, that technique has its pros and cons. A lot of people get their ass chapped when your muzzle goes up, and I understand that. The orientation of our muzzle is a direct reflection of the exact environment and circumstances that we happen to find ourselves in at that moment. So if we happen to find ourselves in that moment where we can't go a muzzle up, well, if you have to go muzzle down, well, just keep in mind, keep your head up. Just remember, if you're in a rubber boat, where's your muzzle going to be? It's going to be up. If you're riding in a helicopter, the crew chief is going to flip shit if your muzzle's up, so it's going to be pointed down. So you can't be absolute to any one technique or another. All right, 2 more techniques. I'm only really going to demo one of them live. The other one, I'm just going to run through it doing dry practice. What that is from right here, and I have my bolt lock back to the rear right now, just so I can manipulate my selector switch and still kind of get a little bit of a trigger press. From right here, when the bolt's locked back, you're firing, you've identified you've actually come to slide lock, bolt lock. From here, you're actually manually stripping, grabbing a new one in, setting the bolt home, and then going right back to it. With that being said, the orientation of our weapon, it being right down here, Is that repeatable day or night? Sure it is. Can we do it while we're moving? Absolutely. Is our hand consistently going to be able to strip a magazine out? Well, sure it is. So that is a technique. The last technique we're going to go over is similar to that, but it's kind of keeping in lines of how a lot of people load an AK, or excuse me, reload an AK. And what that is this. Ooh, hands are hot. That technique is pretty similar to the ways a lot of guys reload an AK. Also, keeping in line with that conversation, if you are one of those guys who does choose to perform tack reloads, it's actually kind of worth noting. Let me dump this ammo real quick. It's actually worth noting that if I actually do choose to perform a tack reload, the way in which I actually go about doing it is by trapping my thumb and my ring or index finger right here, making this kind of space right here between the magazine, and I'm simply dropping and moving it over, which minimizes my dwell time. So if I were to reload like that, say an emergency reload, I'm kind of doing one mechanical action for two totally separate tasks. Now, I'm not saying I'm absolute to reloading like that, because I'm not. I reload it in kind of a variety of circumstances. I guess the big takeaway for this video right now is to keep in mind Hick's Law. Hick's Law states the more solutions you have to any one given problem, the slower we're going to be at choosing the right one. So whatever technique that you're using, fucking own it. Be the best at it. If you can get it done in 3 seconds, well then tomorrow if you're doing some dry practice, get it done in 2.75. When you get it done 2.75, keep climbing that ladder and go for 2.5. It just doesn't matter. Whatever you're doing, make sure it's consistent, repeatable, evaluate it, reevaluate it, and then when you come out here and you take classes, then it goes through its validation paces. So no matter what, just make sure you have that technique that is perfect for you. Until next time, stay safe, stay off them damn keyboards, and quit being a keyboard warrior.